Attorney General Eric Holder once again making some eyebrow-raising comments on race, politics, and saying that the opposition to President Obama. He talks about in an interview with ABC News. Holder spoke candidly, saying he feels some of the contention directed at the president and his administration has to do with race. Here he is.
There's a certain level of vehemence, it seems to me, that's directed at me, directed at the president. You know, people talk about taking their country back. You know, I can't look into people's hearts, look into people's minds, but it seems to me that this president has been treated differently than others. There's a certain racial component to this for some people. I don't think this is the thing, is a main driver, but for some, there's a racial animus.
Jason, you wrote an op-ed today, and it's titled, the theme says, Team Obama's message, vote Democrat because Republicans are racist. And here's what you write. You said in 2008, Barack Obama outperformed both Al Gore and John Kerry among white voters in states like Texas, Georgia, and the Carolinas. Has it occurred to Mr. Holder that criticism of the president might be due to his performance and not his skin color? Why do you think Eric Holder harbors these feelings?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that I think that however much racism you think remains in this country, the policies promoted by this administration are much more harmful to the prospects of blacks in America than racism. I mean, opposition to school choice, which helps kids out of failing schools, support for minimum wage laws that disproportionately price blacks out of the labor force, those are much more harmful than any residual racism in America.
We can debate that, but to
his point, I think the best rebuttal to what Eric Holder is saying is what President Obama said when he was asked about this some years ago. You might recall Jimmy Carter said a few years back that a lot of the opposition to Obama is due to racism. And Obama said, you know, I was black before the election. And I'd add, he was black before his re-election as well.
What do you say, Charles?
Well, I mean, first of all, Holder's comment is full of caveats. I mean, so many, in fact, that it makes it almost impossible to argue it. He's saying some. Right. He's saying, even at the end of that statement, that I don't think that most of the opposition to the president is because of race. However, he is saying this is what he believes, and I think there are a lot of people who who believe that, and who firmly believe that there is some component of opposition to this president that is based on race. And whether or not that is even explicit race bias, or if that is implicit racial bias, or whatever the case may be, they believe that that is true. The issue I think that we have to look at when looking at this issue is whether or not people can even have that conversation. Can this man actually say that this exists to some degree in America? There's a mountain of social science that says that racial bias exists in America, and undoubtedly that some of that seeps into our politics.
And he talks about that in that same interview, Charles. He says, you know, Pierre Thomas asked him, would you back away from the comments that you made about us being cowards when it comes to dealing with race? And he said, no, I still stand by that. We do a terrible job when it comes to discussing race. You don't buy it?
Eric Holder does not want to have a serious conversation about race in America, nor does President Obama. These two went to Al Sharpton's annual convention to have a conversation about race.
But how is that not having a serious conversation? Does
Al Sharpton strike you as the type of person you turn to have a sober, considered discussion of race in this America? I would submit that you go to Al Sharpton when you want to have exactly the opposite conversation. Well, the question is why? Hang on.
I don't really know that. Listen, listen. Al Sharpton is on a different network, and I don't always agree with the Reverend Al Sharpton. But the Reverend Al Sharpton has been very outspoken in many ways. Has helped a lot of people. And the last time he ran for president, he was actually one of the most sober-sounding people in the arena. That's among Democrats and Republicans.
He's one of the most racially divisive people in this country. You do not go to Al Sharpton to help bring people together racially in America.
Is Al Sharpton one of the most racially divisive or divisive people in the country, or do people make him out to be that way in certain ways? Because if you bring up someone like an Al Sharpton, the right goes, oh my gosh, there it is, there goes Al Sharpton.
No,
is he made out to be the boogeyman?
I think the former. I think this is the agenda that the black left pushes, that racism is an all-purpose explanation for what ails black America. The question is why Holder is making these statements and making them now. And he's making them for political reasons. The Democrats are concerned about turnout among minorities in November. They have not had a lot to offer this group of people in terms of policy, if you look at unemployment rates, if you look at how the economy is doing, all they have to offer here are scaremongering, scaring them to the polls because they're worried, particularly those Democrats.
There are a
red
lot of
states.
tactics people are using to push people to the polls, number one. Number two is when you talk about, blacks on the left, that's a very broad category to use. I think that we need to always look at all groups of people and say that there are many diverse opinions even among black people. Even you can see on this panel, there are different opinions about different things. And I think we need to respect the fact that people of the same skin color, the same gender, the same orientation can have differing opinions about subjects. And once we start to respect that, we can actually have conversations. And those conversations can exist in the presence of Al Sharpton and anybody else. Al Sharpton has lived many decades. And I think that you have to take every human being and look at the totality of their life and say, it has not always been perfect, but there are good parts and bad parts, and we can have conversations with this person, whoever they are. And I think that is a proper way to look at any human being.